Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at decks that I have rescued from purgatory and decks that I have repurchased, which are all my second chance decks, which is a VR to Lisa Papez. I'll leave a link to her original video in the description box below for you. So I've done a few different videos on like purgatory boxes and deck decluttering and all that kind of good stuff. I'm kind of over the decluttering portion, I think, of my current practice. It tends to ebb and flow for me. I accumulate decks, I move decks out. I think at the beginning of the year, around 2021 and into this year, there was a big kind of push for me personally to kind of move out some of the stuff that I had accumulated over the last couple years that I wasn't really using because I wanted to make space for new things, let's just be honest. And so I moved out a bunch of decks, and it was funny when I was getting ready to put this video together, I actually went through all my old videos where I had talked about decks that I was decluttering or rehoming or had in my purgatory box. And of the several dozen of those decks, I have only rescued 3 from purgatory and repurchased a small handful. Let me see, I have 6 decks that I have repurchased. And so over the course of the last 3 years that I've been on YouTube, I feel like that's pretty good, right? I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of, where my practice is at. However, I've done many videos talking about how my practice ebbs and flows, how my deck usage ebbs and flows. I'm very much all about bringing things in that work for me and moving along things that don't. Occasionally that does mean that I rehome something that I later on am like, oh, now I really need that for this work that I'm doing. We're gonna take a look at a couple of those. Actually, about half of the decks I repurchased fall into that category for me, so we'll take a look at those in a moment. So let's start things off with talking about the decks that I rescued from purgatory. Now, although I've always had a purgatory box, and I have one currently, and there are decks in that box, my purgatory box is where I keep decks that I'm like thinking that I might want to rehome them. I never want to jump on that. So I put them in that box and I let them hang out there for several months, sometimes a year or two, until I kind of decide, do I ever miss it and do I ever go looking in that box for it? So in that whole purgatory thing that I've been doing for the last few years, there's really only been a handful of decks that I've rescued. I think that I've rescued a couple, maybe 1 or 2 more, but I didn't make videos about that, so it's really hard for me to remember. From my latest purgatory video from a couple months ago, these were the decks that I had featured there. I know that these 2 decks have been in purgatory multiple times, and I keep rescuing them, so I think it's just clear that they need to stay in my collection. Okay, let's talk about the decks. So let's start with this one, who not only did I rescue this deck from purgatory, I bought it a new bag. I think this shop is Crystal Haven on Etsy. I'll definitely leave a link for that in the description box below. But I was kind of like, first of all, I bought another bag for another deck, and I saw this one and I thought, that might be a really good fit for my Pagan Otherworlds. The bag I had made for it was one I made myself, and it was kind of like one of my first attempts at making tarot bags, and it was a little bit wonky, didn't really fit right. And I just thought this kind of had that look and feel that the Pagan Otherworlds gave me. And I always have these moon cards in here. This deck has come and gone in purgatory countless times. The cardstock is beautiful, actually. Like, I'm not sad about the cardstock. It's gorgeous, gorgeous linen. It shuffles beautifully, but it's oversized for a tarot deck. Like, it's not a standard tarot size that we tend to see most of the time these days. And that for me is a great size. If you saw my recent cardstock rant video, you know that I have small hands, and that's a hard thing for me. When a deck is too large for me to shuffle, then it just ends up going everywhere and I don't want to work with it. However, this deck is so freaking gorgeous, and I absolutely love everything about it besides the size. I think I talked about, the cardstock, like it's super slippy and stuff, but I think I think that if this deck were just a little bit smaller, that I would actually be able to work with it. So after, let's face it, years of debating on whether or not to trim this deck, which I do still use, like even though I complain about it, I fight with it, right? I do still use this deck. And for me, that's kind of the key when a deck ends up coming back out of purgatory many times. It's because I've gone to use it again. And I consistently keep getting this deck back out of purgatory. And I'm at the point where like, I don't even know why I keep sticking it in there, because clearly I'm just gonna get it back out again. I absolutely love this deck. And it really is a treasured deck in my collection. I just get so frustrated when I try to use it because it's so large that I end up spewing cards everywhere. And it's really just a combination of the deck being super slippy, which in most cases is actually not a bad thing. But you combine that with the size being too large for me to actually hang on to, then every time I get this deck out and shuffle it, the cards do go flying. I do have like a fear that at some point I will lose a card because of that, because that has happened to me in the past. I've had to replace whole decks because I've lost cards, and it's usually in a deck where the cards go flying whenever I shuffle it. But I think at this point, clearly this is a deck that means a lot to me because it's still here. I keep rescuing it from purgatory, and not only do I keep rescuing it, but I keep freaking using it. So clearly it's a deck that I love. And so I think I'm at the point with this deck where I'm just gonna go ahead and trim it because it's been years and it's ridiculous. I have never had a deck that I have been so on the fence about trimming. I know if I totally screw this deck up that I can replace it. And I think one of the things is, I think one of my hesitations is because I love this deck so much that I'm scared to ruin it, right? I'm scared that I will mess it up if I trim it, and that it won't look the same or feel the same or anything like that. And so it's my own fears and my own hesitations that's keeping me from doing it, but I think I'm ready. I think it's time. So I'm gonna go ahead and bite the bullet, and I'm just going to trim this deck down so I can make it smaller so that hopefully I can work with it in a way that works for me. So that is one of the decks that I consistently get frustrated with, throw into my purgatory box, and inevitably get right back out. So it is permanently staying out of the purgatory box now. So another deck that goes in and out of purgatory is the textured tarot. Again, I spoke about this deck. It's probably still in the same order that it was the last time I showed it. I keep putting things on the wrong side. And I love the imagery in this deck. I love all the textiles. I love the layers. I love the collaging. It is a wonderful, wonderful tarot deck. I absolutely love working with the concept and the imagery. I hate working with the deck on a physical level because it is cardboard-like. I forget, there's a name for this. I always mean to look it up before I talk about this deck in a video. It's like, it's super eco-friendly and all of that stuff, which is great. But as I've mentioned in other videos, I have other decks that are also on very eco-friendly, very eco-friendly printing that don't have cardstock like this. And this, I have seen so many pictures of this deck where the cards have been literally bent to the point where it creates big creases in the deck. So this is a case of I absolutely love the deck. I absolutely detest the cardstock because I'm scared to use it. And this is a deck that I use very, very carefully. I shuffle it very, very carefully. And as I recently talked about in my cardstock video, shuffling is a huge part of my reading practice and my reading process. And so on the one hand, it does make me be very mindful about how I'm working with this deck and how I'm shuffling it. I absolutely love this card. It's one of my favorites. We had a horse like that when I was growing up. Looked just like that one. Anyway, it's a deck that, it offers so much when I work with it. And I make the exception for this deck. I do occasionally get, like, when I get into one of my moods about my decks where I'm like, I only want decks I'm gonna work with, right? That's just a mood for me. It's not a constant. That's a mood, and usually that mood passes very quickly, and it's why I started creating a purgatory box in the first place, so that when I was in one of those moods, I didn't just immediately throw decks up for rehoming and then regret it later on, because I have done that in the past. And a couple of these decks are instances like that. But this deck is fantastic. It's beautiful. But when I get in one of those moods where I'm like, I am sick to death of cardstock that I can't actually work with, this deck always ends up in the purgatory box because of that, because it's the first deck that comes to mind when I think about cardstock that is literally unable to riffle shuffle. If you riffle shuffle this deck, you will ruin it. And everybody I know that has ruined it has done so by riffle shuffling. So, and as you know, that's like my primary shuffling method. But I keep hanging on to it because I love the imagery so much. Apparently, we're just going to flip through all these cards as I talk about all these decks. Like, I need to really step it up. But it has amazing imagery. I love the backs. I just cannot stand the fact that I can't shuffle it. I definitely have to very carefully overhand shuffle it. And I have heard of people bending their cards doing just this as well. Not even attempting to riffle shuffle it, but actually bending cards, overhanding it as well. So there is that. But I love the artwork so much that every time it goes into the purgatory box, eventually I pull it back out because, like, I want to work with the imagery. I love the imagery. And I mean, I have a ton of decks like this. I have a ton of collage decks, but this one, I don't know. I think it was also one of my first collage decks, one of my first indie collage decks. So I kind of have a little bit of a personal attachment to it in that way. But yeah, it's just one of those decks that I keep rescuing. So I'm going to hang on to it. And it's just one that I have to be really, really, really careful when I work with. I would love it though if this creator would come out with this deck on just some nice linen cardstock. I would totally buy another copy of it. Okay, so another deck that I rescued from Purgatory. Oh my goodness, I need to pick up the pace. I keep saying that, but this is the Mysteries of Mary. Now, I have talked about this deck many times in that it has, like, this deck is a one trick pony for me. It's a beautiful deck. It's beautiful writing, just as I mentioned in my Purgatory video. But it really only serves one purpose for me, and that is to pull a card and then read from the book, which is actually not very functional in terms of a tarot deck. It works okay as an oracle in that sense. What I found was that after I put it in Purgatory and I thought about it, I did get back into it. So that's always a key as well, right? And I don't have anything else in my collection that is quite like this. I know in my Purgatory video, I compared it to a bunch of my other Mary decks. And I can substitute any one of my other Mary decks for this deck. But it does feel a little bit different. And it does, like, part of it is also that I don't want to give up the guidebook because the guidebook is really cool. It has a lot of really great stories in it. And there's a lot of research that's gone into this deck and this guidebook. A lot of it is I don't want to give up the guidebook. So I'm keeping the deck but also because I want to keep the guidebook. And it just, yeah, it's different. And it's one of those things that maybe I won't use it that often. Maybe I'll only use it during really special workings with Mother Mary because that is an energy that I work with. But it's definitely not an everyday reader by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm okay with having decks in my collection that aren't everyday readers, that just serve a purpose once or twice a year. I'm okay with that. So that's where this one ended up. So now we're going to talk about decks that I repurchased, and we're going to start with this one because this one's a little bit of an odd one because the first copy of this deck that I had, and this is obviously the 5th tarot, and I showed it on my Purgatory video and I didn't even dig it out. I'm sorry, I probably should have, but I didn't. I had mentioned this deck in that Purgatory video that it's upside down, that it had come out in a new cardstock. It feels like, I'm gonna be honest, it feels kind of like lamination, but I don't hate it. I'm not real fond of this. The gold gilding, it doesn't match. Like we have this kind of like pastel-y cartoon. I don't mean cartoony in a bad way, but a pastel, almost Crayola-like look to the cards and these borders, which all do mean something. And I do have the big book and I have read the big book. And then we have these bright yellow and purple backs. And then we have this weird gold gilding that honestly hurts my hands. So I'm probably going to chop it off, but I don't get that as a choice. I feel like that was just gilding added to add gilding to a deck, but anyway, let's take a quick flip through it as I chat about it. I had mentioned in the Purgatory video that I had the first edition in Purgatory, which was on a really plasticky kind of cardstock that I really, really didn't like. And but that I had seen that this edition was out and that I was thinking about repurchasing it in this new cardstock, which I did, clearly, because it's in my hands. And so I do still have the first edition that I need to probably rehome, except for I don't want to give up the big book. So again, that's another one where I'm like, I mean, I did buy the book and the deck together, so I feel like they do kind of belong together, but I just got the deck for this one and I do want to keep the big book, so I may just repurpose those cards into something else. But anyway, I'm excited to try this one. I really didn't ever play with it the first time. I read the whole guidebook through and through, made tons of notes and stuff, but I never worked with the deck much because the cardstock was not good, so I didn't. So anyway, I repurchased this one because I'm hopeful that now that it's in a different cardstock, I am gonna have to trim that gilding off, but you know, that's okay. I don't mind trimming a deck. But that's one that I did repurchase. The first edition is in the Purgatory box, but it's like the same deck. I repurchased it, right? And I may end up pulling the first one out and just doing something else with it because, again, I'm not going to give up the big, beautiful guidebook. So the next deck that I repurchased is kind of like it's the same deck, but it's a different edition. So does that count? I mean, I'm going to count it because it's still the same deck. But this is the Margaret Peterson Tarot, and this is, I think this is called the GB edition. On Amazon. I think it's just the anniversary edition, the 20th anniversary edition. And it has the backs that's the full bleed. The edition I had before was the gray one. It did have a white border on the back and it had gray borders. And I didn't really get on with that edition. And I talked about this deck quite a bit in my monthly reflections from June because this was a deck that I worked very heavily with in June. But there's something about the different colored borders that just gives this deck a totally different energy for me. I didn't connect with it at all when it had the gray borders. I have been tempted. I said I wasn't, but recently I've been tempted to maybe pick up the gray one only because I'm curious. I don't feel like I need it. I have this one. I love this one. It works beautifully for me. Something about these maroon purple borders just really makes this deck feel so much warmer and more approachable to me. And again, it's just probably a me thing. But I mean, I have considered getting the gray one just to see. I'm just kind of curious now because was it a matter of I just wasn't ready for this deck at the time that I had that one? Or was it literally the aesthetics of it with the gray borders making the deck feel different than it does in this edition? Because this edition I absolutely love. And it's beautiful, and the guide, I mean, I think the guidebook's the same with both editions, but this one is just absolutely, it's just absolutely stunning. And I really, really enjoy working with it. I really enjoyed my very intense work with it in June. It's definitely one that I plan on working with again, but in truth is a deck that I had in the gray bordered edition and rehomed and then purchased this one because Marlena made me do it. And I absolutely love it. So this is one that I did repurchase it. I purchased a different edition, but it is still essentially the same deck, so I'm gonna count it. So another deck that I repurchased is the Line Strider Tarot. And this is a deck that I rehomed, I wanna say about 2 years ago, maybe. And I do have to say that this is one deck that I am super sorry that I rehomed my original one that I had because it had the old mushy Llewellyn cardstock that I absolutely love. But the reason I repurchased it was because I was finding I wanted decks with some more white space in it. There are particular times in my life and in my practice where I want a lot of this clean white space energy. It definitely tends to be more toward the beginning time of the year. I tend to really crave this clean slate energy. And I do have some other decks that do this, but I kind of was just craving the sort of white space, but that emotional undercurrent that I feel exists in the Line Strider. I also have the 2 other Oracle decks by this creator, and this is one of those instances where I wanted them all. I did rehome the Lenormand deck I had from this creator, and I don't really regret that because I don't really read with Lenormand very often. And as we often say, Lenormand is, a ship is a ship is a ship. It doesn't matter what deck you're using. And honestly, if I'm going to read Lenormand, I'm going to use the deck I made. So I did rehome that one, and I don't feel bad about that at all. I have no regrets about that. But I was regretting rehoming this one, particularly because this has a different cardstock. I don't mind this cardstock at all, but I loved the cardstock of the earlier edition that I had that was all that mushy. Like, I don't even know what other word to use for it. But if you shuffled an old Llewellyn deck, you probably know what cardstock I'm talking about, and I wish I would have kept that one. But that's okay. I have the deck back now, and that's the most important thing. But I was definitely craving this energy. It's very much a white space, kind of a breath of fresh air, but I think it's all the watercolor. There's this strong emotional undercurrent to it, which is really interesting when you're looking at wanting a deck that is almost like clear of mind, but really in touch with emotional landscapes. And that's kind of how this deck functions for me. And I really don't have a lot of decks that I feel like I could use that language to describe it. And so I was in particular missing this deck specifically, not just that energy, but this deck specifically. And so I decided to go ahead and repurchase this one. And I think I repurchased it around the time that I actually purchased the Winter Seer Oracle. The Hedgewitch Botanical Oracle from this creator, you've probably seen a million times on my channel because it's one of my favorites. It sits in my favorite basket, and it's a deck that I use all the time. So now I like having the main tarot along with the 2 oracles. She does have another tarot out that I've looked at. It may hit my hands at some point, but as of right now, the Line Strider is just the one that I've kind of been gravitating towards. All right, so I've pulled these 3 out together because these 3 are the 3 decks that I repurchased because I specifically wanted to do Fey work in July, and I realized that I needed these 3 decks to do that work with, or that I wanted, I should say, these 3 decks to do that work with. Let's start with this one. This one is the Fairies Oracle by Brian Froud. Now, I actually rebought this one mostly to get the book. I have his other, the Heart of Fairies deck, and I much prefer that deck to this one. I much prefer the artwork in that one as well. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong. Like, it's a beautiful Fae deck, but I really, really wanted the book because the Heart of Fairies Oracle book doesn't really talk a lot about working with Fae energy. It's not quite as in-depth as the guidebook that comes with this deck is. So I mostly repurchased this deck because I wanted the guidebook. But now I have the deck too. And clearly I've made a hot mess of them. But this was one that, because I knew I was going to be working with Fae energy in July, I wanted to go ahead and grab this so that I would have access to the Fairies Oracle book. Now let's talk about the John Bauer Tarot, because this is the main deck that I've been using for my monthly medicine for July. There's another card stuck in there, but it's okay. This deck it's fantastic, and the first copy that I had trimmed it and rebacked it, which was fine. I actually liked it like that as well. But I realized that I did want the tarot associations back on it because I had chopped those off, and I was like, I just don't know if I'm really going to use it as much anymore. And then when I started doing the Fae work in July, I was like, oh, this is the deck I want, though. This is the deck that I want to be working with in relation to the Fae work, because it helps tie it together for me. And I'll get into that more in my monthly reflections for July when I talk about that. But I did decide that I want this deck back, and I did just want it back with its, you know, regular borders and untrimmed and all of that. I will probably still edge it at some point this month. That is my intention, but it's a deck that I thought I really wasn't going to use much, and then and I used it quite a bit when I first got it, and then I didn't use it for a long time, and I thought, well, maybe it's just time for it to go. And you know, I wasn't really that thrilled with the modification that I had done with it anymore, and so I decided just to let that one go, and I repurchased this one to work with specifically for July. All right, so another deck that I picked up to work with this month is the Tarot of the Secret Forest. It's got a great little box. I will be making a bag for it. This is the second time, of course, that I've had this deck, and this again was another case of I had trimmed it down to just the artwork, and that was fine. And I really, really enjoyed working with it in that way for quite some time. But again, we're back to, I wanted the tarot associations for the specific work that I was doing. Absolutely adore the artwork in this deck. It also got really, really small when I trimmed it, which is kind of, I mean, that's usually a good thing, but with the particular work that I was doing in July, I wanted it back full size and with the tarot associations back on it. And I really, really enjoy this deck. I love that it has the backs that are like the raw sketches of the cards, and I read those kind of like this is in light and this is in shadow, and it's like, you know, or subconscious, conscious, however it is, it works into the particular reading that I'm doing, which I really enjoy. Normally it's all flipped around every which way, but I was doing something working specifically with this side. So again, this is another one I want to re-edge. But again, another deck that I have repurchased because I wanted to do specific work with it. And also because, you know, sometimes I mod a deck and that works for me for a while. And then I decide I want it back in either the way it was or in a different configuration or whatever. This time I'm intending to leave the borders on both of these and to just go ahead and edge them. So there you have it, all of the decks that I have repurchased. So Tarot of the Secret Forest, John Bauer Tarot, my Fairies Oracle, the Margaret Peterson Tarot, the Line Strider, sorry, some of them are in bags, the Fifth Tarot, and then we have decks that I have rescued from Purgatory with the Mysteries of Mary, the Textured Tarot, and the Pagan Other Worlds. That is everything that I could come up with over the last couple of years, what I still have, what I, you know, could find from mining my own tarot videos, which is always funny when you do that. But anyway, I'd like to thank Lisa for creating this tag for us, this Second Chance Decks tag. I think it's really cool to see, you know, what we either rescued from the rehome bin or decks that we've repurchased. There is one deck currently still sitting on my wish list. That is a deck that I rehomed and am now considering repurchasing, which is the Dreams of Gaia. That's another one where I was like, I'm never gonna learn this system. And lately I've been kind of feeling like, that might be one that I need back in my life. So it's one that might end up back in a repurchased or second chance pile at some point. But as of right now, this is the whole shebang of what I have. So thank you so much to Lisa for creating this tag for us. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.